Well, I'm going to start out oddly by telling you this is perhaps the most boring presentation you're ever going to hear. Not that it's a boring topic. Shellfish sanitation is extremely important to public health. I mean, that is because we're all growing an animal that filters the water to a point where it bioaccumulates what they feed on, including the algae that they're feeding on, including any possible human pathogens that may be in the water leaching from the soil if there are nearby septic tanks or sewage treatment plants in the area. Certainly your sites are permitted for those kind of things so that you are far, far away from any discharges of that nature, but sometimes they happen. And also because your product is being eaten raw and it's being eaten whole. When people eat shrimp, they only eat the tail meat. When people eat fish, they only eat the fillet. They're not eating the gut and the heart and everything else like a raw oyster, clam, or mussel. So they are, in my opinion, and I think I'm quite correct, they are the most regulated food in America. And that is because of that very, very issue. Now, I was asked to give this talk because Bob Rowe, Executive Director of the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, was unable to attend. And since I'm a representative on that board of directors for the Gulf region, and the steering committee here asked me to give this presentation. And I'm happy to announce that I will be replaced by Terry Boyd of Mississippi, who is the, yes, he deserves applause. It's a huge commitment. And he is the interim executive director of the new Gulf Shellfish Farmers Association. And it's time for me to extend that responsibility to him now. Also, it's relevant for me to give this talk because I'm a veteran of the ISSC. When you go to a seafood restaurant, it is required to have on that menu a consumer information message. You may have noticed it in the past, you may have not. That came out of the education committee I chaired back in the late 90s. And I called those years, the late 80s and 90s, the Vibrio Wars. Vibrio vulnificus became an important topic to the shellfish industry about 1987. And it created quite a challenge because it had nothing to do with sewage sanitation. It's a naturally occurring organism, and it doesn't affect everyone. It only affects at-risk consumers. And in Louisiana, the lawyers of the state of Louisiana insisted that when people started becoming ill with this and it started making headlines, the lawyers in the state of Louisiana insisted our public health agency put a warning, required a warning. And that warning said, warning, eating these shellfish may kill you. And that certainly created a lot of interest in the industry to do something about that. And that was the beginning of the Vibrio Wars. And I did that because of my close association with the Louisiana Oyster Dealers and Growers Association. I could also put on here that I was my parents' favorite son, but I was the only son they had. So what is the ISSC, the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference? Well, first you need to know what the NSSP is, and that is the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. And that is a federal state cooperative program recognized by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference for the sanitary control of molluscan shellfish produced and sold for human consumption. And I'm reading this for you, one, because you may not be able to read it, and the other, this is extremely technical stuff, and I want to make sure it's correct. So the conference is a participation of the FDA, the state, and the industry, and its executive board and task forces and committees to draft changes to the NSSP's Guide for the Control of Molluscan Shellfish, what is commonly called the Model Ordinance. The Model Ordinance is the ordinance nationwide that every shellfish sanitation control authority, your public health agencies, are required to follow. And they are the oversight of all these public health agencies in producing states is the FDA. So you have your regional FDA shellfish specialist that is required that oversees 2 or 3 different states in a region, that visits the public health, goes over their state ordinances and makes sure it is complying to the model ordinance. The shellfish agencies can be also your game wardens. If you're going to have rules and regulations that must be followed that are in the state code, then they need to be enforced. And so the Board of Health generally don't have their own police force. So they'll operate this program with a memorandum of understanding with your state conservation agency that has your game wardens or patrol agencies that'll work in concert with them to enforce these rules and regulations. It also involves the classification of growing waters, whether you're an approved, restricted, or prohibited harvesting. It also includes they're required to make these classifications. They have to do sanitary and shoreline surveys. They have to do regular water sampling. Some of it's nearly monthly, and hundreds of places. And I know in Louisiana there's 400 sites that are sampled, and they're looking for various indicator organisms of human sewage, such as fecal coliform bacteria. They're also looking at harmful algal blooms and vibrios. They don't sample for vibrios, but that's where your time temperature rules come in, when you're required to have a harvested oyster under refrigeration under strict timelines, whether it's in this winter, spring, or summer. In Alabama, for instance, from April through October, we have to have oysters under refrigeration within an hour of harvest. That's to address your vibrio issues. They also are involved in certifying shucking plants and processing plants and using the HACCP concept, hazard control, critical control point procedures, that documents the time and the temperature and the sanitary controls when oysters are shucked, when wet storage is used, and if you're even going to depurate oysters from a closed area for purification. And again, I mentioned there's FDA oversight. The ISSC is organized by 6 different regions, and they're listed here. And there is an executive board, there are task forces, and there are committees. And these, the executive board meets more regularly, and 6 are from the producing Board of Health, states that produce shellfish. Their Board of Health agencies are SSCA, Shellfish Sanitation Control Authority. 3 are from non-producing states, that inland, call it that. 6 industry members, 1 from each region, 1 FDA member, 1 National Marine Fisheries Service member, 1 EPA member, and a member from each task force. The task forces meet at every conference, which occurs every other year. And Task Force 1 addresses growing areas, Task Force 2 addresses processing and distribution, and Task Force 3 covers the administration, the rules that the ISSC has to operate under, its charter and its bylaws. On the task force, there are 8 voting members, which are delegated by the board chair. 4 from the shellfish control agencies, again, 3 from producing states, 1 from non-producing states, and 4 industry members on each task force. And then the executive board, the FDA, NIMS, and EPA all have a non-voting consultant on that. And then there's a long list of committees to participate in. And the growers here are probably very much interested in the aquaculture committee and the wet storage committee. There's a relaying committee. There's all sorts of committees. There's also a mystical, magical Task Force 4 that occurs in the minds of many that head to the hotel bar after a long day of wordsmithing. So, you may spend an hour or more, all day actually, in a committee, deciding whether the auxiliary verb in a sentence is shall or should, may or must. Your eyes will glaze over. So it's very natural to drive someone to drink after having a day or two like that. So this is what an ISSC issue or proposal looks like, and I'll give credit to the ISSC website. All these tables you're going to see in my slides were cut and paste here. I used that because you needed to see what an issue looks like. And at the very top of that, you'll see proposal number, and the 13 means that was originally issued or submitted to the conference for consideration in 2013. The 1 is assigned to which task force it is. It'll be Task Force 1, or that'll begin with a 107. In the 07, it was the 7th proposal submitted that year, so that's how they get numbered. This one was submitted in 2013 by Bob Rowe of East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, and so it's been in the hopper for a while since 2013. Sometimes it can take years for an issue to work through the conference and become part of the new model ordinance draft. And this one, to summarize, shortens required grow-out times of oysters seed obtained from restricted or prohibited areas from 6 months to 1 month when the average daily water temperature is above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It redefines aquaculture as cultivating oysters in controlled conditions for human consumption, including propagation and growing of shellfish occurring in natural or man-made water bodies. It includes shellfish seed production, cultivation in natural water bodies, and when they're held off bottom, such as in use of racks, bags, and cages, and when shellfish are held in man-made water bodies, such as the use of tanks, ponds, and raceways. Aquaculture does not include depuration or wet storage. That is in Task Force 2. That's considered a process. And the broadcasting of spat or seed being left to mature is the same as wild shellfish, what we call in Louisiana transplanting seed, onto bottom. Allows the hatchery and nursery cultures in prohibited waters, and it requires record keeping for oyster gardening. Several years ago, oyster gardening, which is the non-commercial aspect of growing oysters, to be planted to build reefs for ecological and environmental reasons. There's a risk that some of those oysters could be brought into the market or eaten, so that there are new rules for oyster gardening, and it emphasizes that those are not for harvest for human consumption. And so this table is what is found usually at the bottom or at the end of an issue, and it summarizes, how it has moved through the committee and what the results are. And I've highlighted there in yellow that this still is under consideration since 2013, and the Aquaculture Committee that this has been assigned to is charged with developing more guidance documents, and that's where it stands right now. The next issue that I thought important was submitted in 2019 by Bob Rowe, and the summary of this is, for states that have not established a minimum market size, the authority shall establish record-keeping protocols to track seed sourced from prohibited waters to ensure seed have at least 60 days of growing with water temperatures above 50 degrees before sale to human consumption. There is concern that if you grow seed in a prohibited area, that there is enough time, once that seed is placed in an approved area for culture, that there's enough time for those seed to grow out and not become a concern for human consumption. For instance, at our farm in Navy Cove, we can reach market size in 6 months. And so the question is, okay, if that seed, perhaps if it was in a prohibited area, which we grow our own seeds, so that's not an issue, is that seed have enough time to purge out any human pathogenic organism they may have filtered out of the water as seed before they reach enough time before they reach market size? There's not always a lot of common sense at the ISSC. Here's another issue issued in 2019 by the FDA. And the summary of this, it recommends that sample stations' locations shall be adjacent to actual and potential sources of pollution and adequate in terms of number and spatial distribution to support the conclusion that the growing area is characterized by water quality meeting the approved classification bacteriological requirements. And it is still in committee, and that's concerning to me, because what this is proposing is those sample sites that they currently are using, preferably close to your oysters to represent the water quality at your site. It's proposing that those sample sites get moved near the outfall of your sewage treatment plants nearby, and that could be quite problematic. Ever since the early 60s, there's been an axiom that's the solution to pollution is dilution. So, if you have a point source that's quite a ways away from your farm, fortunately, there's quite a bit of ways to dilute any issue that may be occurring from that point source, although that point source has to be taken under consideration by the Board of Health when they do their sanitary and shoreline surveys. Here's another one that's issued by the Massachusetts of Marine Fisheries, in its summary, and it was proposed in 2019, and it's still under consideration. pertinent to emergency closures defines the time period up to 1 year the authority has to determine the source of a pollutant, the contaminant, before initiating a reclassification of the growing area. So the current language is limited to temporary period. So this is addressing when an area is closed and when it can reopen. Naturally, all of us growers prefer if we have a closure due to a failure to a nearby sewage treatment plant or a rainfall event, that we want to get reopened as soon as possible. And this is one of the issues that's addressing that topic. Again, it is still being considered by the task force. Another one issued in 2019 by the state of Alaska. It rewrites and moves the marine biotoxin control section from guidance documents, which are typically found at the end of the model ordinance. Guidance documents are educational materials for your shellfish control authorities to use in writing their state ordinances. It's moving the marine biotoxin control section from guidance documents to the actual chapter within the model ordinance in the shellfish growing area. That would be Task Force 1 again. And it removes heat processing as an alternative allowable treatment. Many of you may already know that when your oysters have filtered harmful algal blooms, cooking does not address the issue as it would if it were bacterial or viral. This one was also issued in 2019 by the state of Alaska. In the summary, it rewrites the biotoxic guidance documents. It defines a contingency plan for non-historic outbreak growing areas and a management plan for historical outbreak growing areas. So some of you might be opened or closed by some of these harmful algal bloom events, and this issue particularly addresses that, and it is still in conference and being debated. Another one issued in 2019 by an industry member up in Maine requests guidance language to apply to new research results with current dye study methods to assess wastewater treatment plants' effluent viral impacts on adjacent growing areas. Proposes effluent time series sampling analysis 2 to 3 times a week to establish a database for each wastewater treatment plant to be used to identify times when plant performance is degraded by predictable operational and environmental conditions. Provides better information for the establishment of growing area closure lines for classification purposes. In there, under the proposed subject there, it says guidance for addressing viral impact of wastewater treatment plants, outfalls, on adjacent growing areas using the male-specific coleophage method, which is a bacteriological method that's relatively new as applied to shellfish sanitation. So what he's proposing here is to use more advanced or the newest methods that are available that research has found to help address closures due to faulty sewage treatment plants. This one is by the FDA. Submitted in 2019, requires that the shellfish sanitation control authorities to conduct additional statistically valid studies after a wastewater treatment plant fails to conditionally approved or conditionally restricted growing water classifications of management plans, including time interval necessary for the reduction of coliform levels of shell stock and water to pre-closure levels. So this again is addressing the way the water should be sampled and how often and how frequent and where when a wastewater treatment plant goes out of compliance. So this is a newer one. This was submitted for this year, 2023, which I may not have mentioned that the meeting is in a week in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Maine's Department of Marine Resources, and its summary is adds the growing or gathering of seed or nursery culture for aquaculture and resource management to list of exempted shellfish activities in prohibited growing areas, which is a good thing for us. Traditionally, hatcheries and nurseries did not fall under the NSSP. And since I've attended an ISSC, apparently that's become an issue, and so now they're redefining or making sure it's defined in the model ordinance that they do not, especially if they're being conducted in a prohibited area. Generally speaking, the fecal coliform bacteria that you may find in the water from human sewage is not all that much of a concern at a hatchery or a nursery. It's more of a concern at grow out, of course, because it's an indicator of human sewage. This is a new submission for this year by the Virginia Department of Health, and it summarizes, alters the language relating to the harvest area closures due to a viral outbreak. The current language states that the areas remain closed for 21 days from the first day of viral outbreak was identified. The proposed language states that the 21-day viral cleansing timeline starts on the last day of harvest of implicated shell stock, and the area must remain closed for 21 days following the last harvest date. So this year's ISSC, the Task Force 1, this is number 103, Task Force 1 will review this proposal and send it to the appropriate committee. And it's at the committee level where all this discussion and debate occurs before it goes back to the task force for approval. Oh, also, I forgot to mention that after issues finally are cleared by the task force, all these things go before the final day of the ISSC conference. It's called the General Assembly, where all the proposals, changes are voted on by your Shellfish Control Authority representatives. Industry doesn't get to vote, FDA doesn't get to vote, the federal level doesn't get to vote, only the state level Shellfish Control Authorities vote on that final day. And what that does is it fosters industry to have more close relationships with their Board of Health people. Many times your Board of Health people are struggling to do their job because of all these, I consider, somewhat onerous regulations. And they're getting hammered from above by FDA to be compliant, and then you might be chewing on their butt because it isn't so convenient for you. Many times they can't do their job because their budgets have been restricted. They don't have the manpower or the resources to go and do the work that they're required by this model ordinance with FDA oversight. So, and in the long run, they're going to be at the General Assembly voting yay or nay on an issue that you may have submitted. So it doesn't help much, or I should say it helps greatly if you're an active member in all this, to have a very close, even personal relationship with the people at these state agencies, because you can work together, because generally speaking, the common enemy is the FDA. And our industry in Louisiana has always thought that if it was up to the FDA, nobody would be eating raw shellfish. This issue is this year's from the Virginia Department of Health. Proposes reducing 60 days to 30 days that states not be expected to close growing areas based on Vibrio parahemolyticus cases that are reported when environmental parameters have changed or monitoring indicates that Vibrio parahemolyticus is at risk. Again, this is just a new issue. Okay, I got to go faster here. Here's another one in this year from Virginia Institute Department of Health, alters the language related to the harvest closing areas due to viral outbreaks. The current language states that the area remained closed for 21 days from the first day of viral outbreak was identified. The proposed language states the 21-day viral cleansing timeline starts on the last day of harvest of implicated shell stock, and the area must remain closed until 21 days following the last harvest date. The next one adds the growing and gathering of seed or nursery culture for aquaculture to the list of exempt shellfish activities. So this is very relevant to the other ones I've mentioned. This one is from Virginia Department of Health, and it alters the language related to harvest closing areas due to viral outbreak. Here's one from Virginia Department of Health. Proposes reducing 60 days to 30 days the states not be expected to close a growing area based on Vibrio parahemolyticus cases. Here's another one from Bob Rowe at the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. Proposes that if an authority has documentation supporting that the non-point source, these are areas that don't have a pipe coming into the water, it's marshland or runoff from land. Non-point sources impacting the growing area are not from a human sewage origin. They may exclude up to 2 outlier data points in the database from the data set being evaluated, using coliform standard to close harvesting areas impacted by wild birds. You know, the idea that birds are resting on your gear and leaving manure behind, and when it rains, all that runs off your gear and into the water has become a concern to the FDA. And now there's you now in your operational plan, at least in Alabama, in your farm operational plan, you need a paragraph in there that states how you're going to deal with that. And in our case, we use that bird away kite. And I have to quickly go through here. There's some things here with wet storage as well, particularly, and wet storage falls under Task Force 2. Guidance documents on water temperatures and wet storage and how long they have to be under a certain temperature. Here's another one regarding wet storage. It changes processed water to non-detectable levels right when your system is being inspected and cleaned before you restart your system. So this gives you an idea. There's a lot of issues here. This is the last one. I'll end with this slide. For more information on all this, if you want something to help you sleep, go to the ISSC.org, click on right there at the top, 2023 ISSC biennial meeting, and that'll bring you to this site below. And there on the left are Task Force 1, Task Force 2, Task Force 3 proposals for consideration. They're PDF files, which is what I read for you to prepare for this meeting. I did you a huge favor. Thank you.